We have been sat down today with Dr. Mark Howells, and we have been discussing the key challenges facing Sustainable Development Goals. So Mark, how can modelling be used in sustainable energy policy making, and how can it be used to assist governments in energy planning?
Right, so this is a big deal. We often hear lots of things out there about how we should reduce our emissions, how we should try and use less energy on the one hand. On the other, there's big industry. They would like to make more money. They want to sell more because that's how they make money. And then governments have got to keep the lights on. We've got to keep things working and things chugging over so society and the economy works. In order to move that conversation from a lot of rhetoric into specific numbers and values, we use energy modeling. So for us to understand how much we should invest, what we should invest, where we should invest in, when we should invest in it, and how much, we need to use some kind of mathematical model to tell us this, so that investors can make investments that, on the one hand, guided by government, help us meet sustainable development goals, but on the other, give sensible information that we can use to develop markets and make money.
So what are the key challenges of inclusive policy making?
Okay, so we've said that energy modeling is important because it puts numbers to some of the goals and aspirations, goals of government, aspirations of industry and investors. Now, the thing is that for that activity to be sustainable, it has to be owned. So this energy modeling activity needs to be a part of policy making. For it to be a part of policy making, it's important that there are people within government who have the ability to run these kinds of numbers so they can think sensibly about the balance between meeting these SDGs and mobilizing the necessary kind of finance and industry that you need to have on board.
What is the significance of energy, water and land nexus in Sustainable Development Goals?
So for a start, a lot of people don't have access to really basic electricity. So just imagine living a day of your life without electricity. That's, for many of us who are lucky enough to live in relatively rich countries, there's no Facebook, there's no Twitter, there's a whole bunch of stuff, there's no FIFA soccer, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes away. But at a much more fundamental level, people don't have access to, if you don't have access to electricity, you don't have access to vaccines, to education, to a whole bunch of important things. So we need more people to get access to electricity. At the same time, if you don't have access to safe drinking water, you run the risk of getting all kinds of waterborne diseases and other things, and just affects health badly. And similarly with food, we have a large proportion of the world's population without access to reliable, sustainable quantities of good, healthy, nutritious food. So we need to do all of these things. And we use resources to get there. We use water, we use energy resources, and we use land. Those resources are limited, but the population is growing. Demands are growing. People are getting richer. They want more. Industry is growing as well. They want more of this stuff too. So in the past, we might have had a lot of resource and a limited demand for that resource. Now the resource is becoming limited and demand is growing very, very fast. These resources further are interlinked. You can't have access to water unless you've got energy to pump it around and to purify it. You can't have access to energy unless you've got water to cool power stations or to produce biofuel or to run through turbines and hydropower systems. And similarly, you can't farm land without water going in for the crops and at the same time energy, so you've got your tractors and other things to produce food. So these three are all interlinked. And so the tighter the demand, the tighter the gap between demand and supply becomes, those interlinkages become much, much stronger. So for example, we want to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. This is a big deal. So biofuel is one of the things that we might look at to try and reduce emissions. Now, if you were to fill up a Volvo, I work in Sweden, so I have to use Swedish examples. If you were to fill up a big Volvo with bioethanol, you'd use the same amount of land approximately, and water, and energy that you would require to feed one hungry person for an entire year. So that's now where but a couple of decades' time, we're going to have a lot more people to feed on the planet, and we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions even more. So there's going to be competition over these constrained resources. So we need to think cleverly about how we can integrate their use, because if we don't do that, we're going to find conflicts, like the food versus fuel example I gave a minute ago.
How can we achieve universal access to the population across the globe?
Right, so this is a big deal. As I said earlier on, just imagine for a second life without electricity. And I want to tell a little story right now. So imagine, it's difficult for us to do for obvious reasons, but imagine imagine the situation of a young, pregnant, about to be mother in rural Malawi, let's say, no access to electricity. So she's about to give birth. That means she doesn't go to a clinic with a whole bunch of the medicines and other things we're used to. So she has to give birth with no anesthetic, which would be incredibly painful. Then the child that she gives birth to, we'll call him Temba for this example, is going to be very lucky to survive in many instances, because he's not going to have access to a whole bunch of vaccines and other things that you need a fridge to be able to keep cool. You don't have the fridge because you don't have electricity. Now this little kid, he might grow up, goes to school. He doesn't have the things that we might be lucky enough to have at school. He's not going to be watching this interview, for example, on YouTube or other things, because there's no electricity to run the IT systems or other things there. So he's going to be learning out somewhere in the bush with an old chalkboard and other things. Comes home after going to school. His mom's probably just come back from collecting fuel wood, because again, there's no electricity, so they can't do their cooking on electricity. And she might have spent 4 or 5 hours during that day just collecting fuel wood. Cooks food and other things. The house smells of smoke. There's a lot of smoke in the house. Not that it's an unpleasant smell. It's very nice in a lot of ways. But this kid is going to now only have an hour or two to do any homework. He's not going to be able to play any computer games or watch television or other things. But when the sun sets, that's when his homework time stops. Now, this kid will assume that he's lucky. He gets through, he just has a cough. Something like 1 million people die a year simply because of indoor air pollution, living in a situation like that. So this kid, he gets through school. He's a smart enough, very, very smart young kid. And then he gets his way to university, where he discovers a whole bunch of these things for the first time. There's some electricity and some other things. And he thinks to himself, you know, mathematically, there must be some way I can figure out how to get electricity to people. What would the cost be, and what kind of infrastructure should I put in place? Now, you can do that. There are tools that you can get off the shelf that cost thousands, tens of thousands of euros to be able to get and use and run this sort of analysis. So he can't do it. He doesn't get to do it in his university. He tries to do some stuff. Eventually, he's so determined he gets into government, and he tries to do the same kind of thing, and he finds it very, very difficult. And part of an initiative we're involved in with the United Nations is that we're developing open source tools. So they don't cost these thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, but they give clear, transparent, open source investment analysis for how much it would cost to electrify anybody in any part of Malawi. And so then this guy can go to the World Bank, development agencies, look at other kinds of agreements or cooperation potential that might be out there, and start to think about how to develop an electrification strategy for his country. Small amount of electricity at first doesn't cost much, but that would be enough at least for lighting in his school, so his education prospects improve. A little bit more electricity would mean that his mom maybe doesn't have to go out and collect fuel wood, and doesn't have to do the washing in the river, and has access to the vaccines, and he has access to vaccines too. And then even more electricity means that that rural community, instead of surviving on extensive agriculture that's not very efficient, might be able to do some mechanized stuff, and there'll be industry and other things that develop, agro-industry that develop around that. And so, short answer to your question, you need good, clear tools that people can have access to do this kind of investment planning.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mark Howells, for joining us today.
My pleasure.